Thanks everyone for coming to this afternoon breakout session. So the official title of this is Managing Political Turbulence as a Business Leader. But generally, we're going to be exploring topics like the influence of geopolitical risk and uncertainty on business. And I guess that's still relevant today. We'll see. But I think this topic covers a penumbra of issues like geopolitical shifts, but also shareholder activism, social media amplification, and declining trust in institutions and liberal democracies more generally. So I want to introduce this august panel. We have a great group of people that are really experts in this topic, both in terms of the theory and practice. So our first speaker is Nick Bloom, who's the William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford, a senior fellow at DAPER, and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on management practices and uncertainty, and he previously has worked at both the UK Treasury and McKinsey. Our next speaker is John Donahoe. His current role is the chair of the Stanford Athletics Department, where he serves as the director of the Department of Athletics, Physical Education, and Recreation. Prior to helping us rebuild the Stanford football team, he's the former president and CEO of Nike. He served on the board of directors of Nike in 2014 and then took the role of CEO in 2020. And prior to joining Nike, he had a huge executive experience being the CEO of ServiceNow, eBay, and Bain & Company. And then our final speaker is Chris George. He's a technology and business leader with experience operating at the intersection of advanced computing, AI, and critical infrastructure. He currently serves as a senior advisor to the US government, but most recently was the president of Intel Government Technologies, where he worked at the nexus of technology, innovation, public institutions, and rapidly shifting policy environments. So really happy to have this group of three people with us. My goal here is just to ask some questions and maybe stimulate a great conversation among the three of you. So I wanted to just kick it off with Nick, and maybe you could kind of frame our discussion by telling us what we know from the academic literature on how uncertainty affects business. And maybe you could kind of help us define what uncertainty means. There's, I'm sure, a lay definition of that term and scientific definitions. And maybe also some things that are counterintuitive that we wouldn't just naturally expect that the research has taught us.
Great. I just noticed John is in Nike shoes. I shouldn't expect anything less.
Stanford colors.
In Stanford colors, yeah, no less. So how to measure it? As an economist, I'm going to give you two answers, like one hand or the other. So there's kind of two main ways to measure. One is look at financial markets. And a classic measure is, are markets bouncing up and down? When you think uncertainty is high, they're jumping up and down. You think of what's going on in Iran, trade attacks, various things with immigration. As it happens, currently markets are not particularly volatile. So in fact, today I was looking at something called the VIX. So it's the forward-looking volatility in the S&P 500. The average over the last 40 years is 20. The value today is 19. So it gives you a sense. Stock markets are claiming uncertainty right now. Surprisingly, it's kind of average. Another way to look at it, which I've been working on for quite a while now, is using text. So scraping newspapers, going to the IMF, looking at the beige book for the Fed, etc. If you scrape text, measures right now are incredibly high. So if you open up the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Economist, there are a ton of articles talking about uncertainty over immigration, trade, Iran, the political system, the Department of Justice, etc. So, how high is it? Weirdly depends on who you ask. These two move really closely together, this text measure and the market measure. In fact, we have a measure of uncertainty in the newspapers we've created called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, and it's used by Bloomberg and Reuters and used by a lot of the banks to price things. So these are great measures. And then since 2025, under Trump, the two have totally diverged. So Wall Street seems to think everything is fine, everything is good, there's no problems. As you know, the S&P 500, I think, is almost at an all-time record. And the newspapers and anything you read seems to be terrified and claiming uncertainty is incredibly high. My sense is it's somewhere in between. In terms of what it does, it's obviously damaging. As you know, in the labor markets now, it's called the great hesitation. So I think labor markets always have the great something, and you just rotate the word after great. So hesitation is the current word. If you have any, we're talking earlier, I teach a bunch of undergrads. It's very hard to get jobs now because the hiring rate is very low. I think the bigger impact of uncertainty will be on the long run. So I was just saying, I just came back from Princeton. I was giving a talk on Monday, and I've been looking at this now for a decade, which is, what is the impact of Brexit? So Brexit, the impact of Brexit looks a lot like what's going on in the US currently now. So there's three similarities. One is kind of anti-immigration, the second is anti-trade, and the third is there's enormous uncertainty from Brexit. So if you remember, there was prime ministers coming and going and coming and going. There was that lettuce that lasted longer than one of the prime ministers. And so that was, nobody knew what was going on. Looking back now 10 years, we can now put real hard numbers on it. It looks like Brexit has cut UK GDP by 6 to 8%, which is an enormous number. 6 to 8% for the average Brit is something like $3,000 to $4,000 a year. It's about as much as we or they, I guess I'm a dual national now, spend on the NHS. So I think everything that's going on right now, the policy uncertainty and indecision, in the short run is probably not going to be that damaging, but if we keep it up 5, 10 years from now, we could have a Brexit situation.
So I want to bring Chris in to respond to that, just in terms of this idea of long-term planning as a business leader. So one thing we've experienced in the US over the last 10 years is policy whiplash, where administrations will come in and out and they keep changing the policy regime, sometimes through legislation, but sometimes through executive orders. So then businesses can't really rely on what the government might be subsidizing or taxing. So if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there was all these promises to subsidize renewable energy. Now the Trump administration is trying to ratchet that back. So if you're trying to be an entrepreneur in clean tech or a venture capitalist in clean tech, it's like, what do you do? So I guess, how do you think about how a business leader needs to respond to the current climate where you can't count on the government having consistent policies?
Yeah, so maybe a little more background on some of the stuff I'd worked on at Intel. So my background is on the semiconductor side, so things like CHIPS Act that was passed, had spent a lot of time on that and trying to make sure that it was constructed in a way that would actually help advance the technology objectives for the country. And now I work more on the defense and national security world for the government, helping advise them on how to work with industry in order to build the types of capabilities that they want to have. So to answer the question, it's hard to navigate the policy whiplash, but one of the tried and true methods is to find the structural trends that will persist across administrations. So as an example, we will need more semiconductors. That will just happen. We're seeing a big crunch right now. During COVID, we saw a huge crunch, in part because of some planning whiplash actually there that happened, where there were expectations from folks like automakers saying, I don't need as many chips. TSMC scaled back some of the production. Then they said, actually, I need everything that I said I was going to need before and more. They said, well, we don't have those chips. You had a bunch of F-150s sitting around without $2 microcontrollers not being able to be sold, as an example. So those sorts of general trends of, I need more chips, I need more compute. AI will be something that impacts a lot of functions across the multiple industries. Those are the things to kind of latch on to. The things not to latch on to is to say, I'm going to pin my entire business's hopes on that single grant from that single vehicle. So if you were betting your entire company on receiving a CHIPS R&D grant and you're a startup, it's like, hey, life got real hard when the new administration came in and they totally revamped the CHIPS office. And on top of that, they revamped how they were handing out some of those R&D grants. So figuring out how do you align with these bigger secular trends, and something I think I'll talk about more a little later as well, is how do you align with not just what's beneficial for your company, but how do you align with what's going to be beneficial for the country later on? Like, those are the things that people will get behind and aren't as subject to some of those things. I mean, there is still whiplash in terms of the policy. The government goes slower than you want it to, but if you can match up with those sort of long-term directions, then it typically goes better.
So John, not sure if you have any thoughts on this, especially, Nike is very dependent on things like tariffs, supply chains, et cetera. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of, if you're the leading organization, how you deal with these external political factors, especially in an era where some neoliberal consensus is maybe dying.
I graduated from the GSB 40 years ago this spring. In fact, a classmate's here somewhere, I think. We were both 11 when we graduated. I took a class on strategy through uncertainty, and one of the things you learn is how to think in a somewhat dynamic way. And I agree with what both Chris and Nick said, which is identifying what are the things as you think forward that you think are structural and are going to see their way through whatever administration, fad, exogenous shift like COVID is going to happen. And then what are the things that are more temporal? And you never know if you have it right, but trying to separate those things, paying more attention to the structural things, understanding the temporal things that you got to deal with, but don't bet, as you said, don't bet your future on them. Be ready for them. I learned that here, and I actually think I use that throughout my career because, there's a lot of uncertainty now, but frankly, 15 years ago on the internet, and felt like a lot of uncertainty, and 5 years ago with COVID, it felt like a lot of uncertainty. And so I think uncertainty is here to stay. It's driven by different things. This one happens to be driven by a president that's a little bit all over the map, and geopolitics that's highly uncertain. But I think that skill of separating those two things is at least one way to try to be able to have a dialogue with your teammates and others on it.
So just to kind of stay with you, so one source of political turbulence and uncertainty are leadership decisions that elected officials or bureaucrats can make. But one thing we've noticed, over the last 10 years is that the social environment can also create turbulence. That regular people, for good reasons and bad reasons, have a lot more power of affecting the reputation of companies through things like social media, et cetera. So I was wondering if you don't mind, maybe, John, you could take us through the mindset of a case study I actually teach in my class. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, which was when Nike decided to kind of back Colin Kaepernick in 2018. So if people don't know, this was an NFL star who spoke out against police brutality and was essentially blackballed from the league. And I talked to people in the NFL about this, and they said, if we hire this guy, our season ticket numbers will decrease by 30%. Like, they had data on that. And Nike, a major figure in athletics, took a very interesting social stand, having this very controversial person as an endorser. So, I'd always thought that the athletic endorsers, many of whom are African American, were a key stakeholder group in this that Nike relies on. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, what were the discussions within Nike, why most companies would have just stayed silent and just avoided it. So, how do you think about this?
Yeah, well, Neil, I was on the board when the Kaepernick thing happened, not in the CEO seat. So I got to see the outputs of it, but I was CEO when George Floyd happened. And so it was a let's say, an analogous situation. And as you said, there's just enormous pressure. In fact, in my entire time there was enormous pressure to speak up on immigration, speak up on Israel, Palestinian, speak up on racial relations. And I think the thing that when at least I had to learn to do, and I think most CEOs or leaders of organizations have to do, I'm sure John Levin's got to think about this, which is separate your personal views, where you may say something, from, and tell your employees they need to separate their personal views from where it is appropriate for an organization to speak up or speak out on a topic. And there, I think you have to think about what are the very few things that are core to your purpose. And so let me use a couple examples. When I was in technology at eBay or ServiceNow, immigration was very core to our purpose. So immigration policy mattered, and we would have been more willing to speak up on that. When I got to Nike, immigration wasn't a top 10 issues. I cared about it personally, but I wasn't going to speak out on behalf of Nike on immigration. Gun control is a topic that I feel strongly personally about. I think it's at the root cause of a significant number of problems in our society. And yet, at Nike, gun control wasn't something they could speak up on. But Doug McMillan at Walmart is the largest gun distributor, or Ed Stack at Dick's Sporting Goods did, because it was core to their business models. Racial relations is not exactly the first thing you want to be speaking out on, because it's not a topic where you're going to get a lot of positive feedback over time. But when I know when we faced George Floyd, I had to reflect on the fact that, as you said, Neil, Nike's brand in many ways was built in partnership with some of the greatest black and brown athletes in history. And Nike's core consumer base skewed quite heavily to urban black and brown consumers. And our athletes, we held our athletes out to be our heroes, and they cared a lot about this topic. And so it wasn't that hard a decision to say, because it is core to who we are and what we stand for, we're going to speak up on it. So in the George Floyd example, we ran a campaign that week that said, just don't do it. And then I spoke out on Black Lives Matter. And I was the enemy on Fox News for months and years afterwards for being a woke CEO in a woke company. But it was core to who we were. And therefore, our employees, I think, felt that the culture and values of a company get reinforced when you speak up. I think the harder time is telling those employees, we're not going to speak up on another topic, Israel-Palestine, or we're not going to speak up on immigration, although you're welcome to have your own personal points of view. So separating those things and figuring out what's core, I think is challenging, but I think it's a really important thing that all leaders face now.
So just a quick follow-up, now we have a very tight labor market, especially with white-collar employees, so maybe employees don't feel like they can say, oh, we're going to quit if you don't take this social stand, but in a low interest rate environment like 2021, 2022, many young employees were demanding their CEOs and management take these positions. So if you had to go back to 2021, 2022, what is the message you tell a young group of employees who maybe have organized and said, you better take a stand on X issue, whether it's Israel or Ukraine or whatever that's not core to your business?
I think it gets back to the same thing. The burden shifts a little bit on the leader to say, here's what we're doing and why. And that may or may not fit with what your interests are, and we respect that. So I'll take two small examples. We mandated getting vaccinated. And boy, you would have thought 80% of the company was going to quit. But out of 80,000 employees, at the end, less than 1,000 did. But the days beforehand, thousands and thousands were going to quit. We mandated returning to work, 3 days a week initially, then 4. You would have thought half the company was going to quit. We had to explain why we were doing it, why we thought these actions were in the best interest of the collective whole. And there may be some people that make different choices and go elsewhere. So I think the amplifiers of social media are ahead of the reality of people willing to take action, even in tight labor markets. And so, but it puts the burden of responsibility on saying, why are we saying, you can't no longer say it, we're back to work because we want to be. Actually, no, we're back in the workplace because this is why we think it's in our collective best interest. I understand that everyone's circumstance is different. For some of you, this may not work for you, but for our collective whole, here's the decision we're going to make. Actually, I think President Levin and Jenny made that decision at Stanford, right? Explaining why it's in the best interest of the collective whole. And by and large, I think people, they also self-regulate a little bit, and you can't get too driven by the noisy tales, because the noisy tales are the ones that get amplified in the current communication platforms. I'm facing this right now with athletics. There are some people that have really strong opinions. And the question is this a collective opinion, or is this the opinion of a few people that have a megaphone and are willing to use it? And that's one of the delicious challenges of being a leader these days.
So Chris, I want to get your thoughts from a different perspective. So Nike's a B2C company. It's always confused me whether Intel's a B2C or B2B company, but let's just claim it's a B2B company for now. A lot of it is okay, well, we might have to take a stand on Kaepernick because we have key consumer constituencies that might care, but Intel might have a different perspective. So we actually teach a case on Intel as well about when your former COO, Brian Krzanich, decided to not have Intel involved with conflict minerals, so going conflict-free in their production of their microprocessors. And the students and I, we debate on whether, what's the business purpose of this, since Intel's customers are OEMs, generally. So I'm kind of curious from Intel's perspective, how do they decide what social stands they take and like what social interests they choose to get involved in.
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak a little bit about the experience at Intel, and then a bit more broadly, and I'd probably start, and I wrote it down because I like the way you said it, John, that figuring out the issues that are actually core to the business model. And so for Intel, it was about, so, you know, similar to your experience working at eBay, and in the tech world, it's like immigration. That is a core business model issue because you need to be able to get the talent required from a lot of these countries, and you need to make sure that when you have people coming over, that they don't feel like they're under the gun and that, you know, that their life could be totally disrupted. It's like folks need to be able to come and settle in the country, and we want to have all the absolute smartest people from every other country in the world coming here and staying here and working for our technology companies to make them the best in the world. And then we can export our technology. So the way that Intel would approach it is there were a lot of things, again, similar to what John said. It's like, hey, that's just not part of our core, that's not core to our business. People have opinions, and sometimes people would choose to express them, but it was always clear at the leadership level that what the company stood for were issues that actually would move the needle for us from a business point of view. And I think on whether it's conflict minerals, whether it's immigration, whether it's certainly export policy and tariff policy, which is super, super applicable for a company like Intel or NVIDIA or a host of other folks, you know, that's where you weigh it out and you say, like, all right, exactly what do we think the business impact will be? And the business impact could just be in terms of straight revenue. It also could be in terms of employee engagement or, you know, brand value, and you know, weighing out and saying, is this how essential is this to us? And the other challenge is if you take a stand on 50 different things, like it kind of diminishes what you're taking a stand on. So you kind of got to pick some winners, so to speak. You got to pick what you want to be loud about. Otherwise, it's like, oh, I guess Intel cares just as much about, say, DEI as it cares about immigration. It's like, no. They care way more about, or they care a lot about immigration because that's, you know, that is dramatically impacting the business. Not to say the DEI piece isn't important, it's just that you can't speak out about everything. And so that was another, you know, as we would go through the comms policy and the comms strategy as a company, that's something that we weighed really heavily was how do we make sure that our message is clear, easy to understand, because when you're talking to policymakers, if you come with a long list of every single thing that, you know, you want to talk about, they get nothing from it at the end. They're like, all right, well, I met with Intel, or I met with AMD, or I met with Google, and I don't know what they want. So
Nick, I want to give you a chance to chime in, and primarily, you know, you mentioned that like economists look at, you know, things like the VIX as like a measure of uncertainty, but our discussion so far has been that there's a much more broad view of uncertainty, including, you know, concerns to companies' reputational risk from different constituencies. So yeah, curious if you have any thoughts on what you've heard.
I was actually going to do something that's kind of unusual. I was actually going to ask the moderator a question. So I'll give you a fact. I'll ask you a question, actually bounce back to John. So a fact, I was at a seminar the other week, and as backdrop, once a quarter publicly listed companies are on earnings calls. You must have done a bunch of these earnings calls. So just to be clear, an earnings call normally you have, typically the CEO would talk for about 20, 30 minutes, and then investors will fire questions at the CEO, often the head of corporate, you know, the CFO or investor relations.
They're a lot of fun. They're really a lot of fun.
As John said, they're a lot of fun. I'm sure you prepped for them, I'm sure, in advance, right?
Yes, I did 60 of them.
Okay, so the reason I raise this is we have thousands of these earnings calls a quarter, and what folks have done of text to data is look at how much of this discussion is about politics. And one thing you can probably guess is the amount about politics is kind of moderate, but it's dropped by about 50% under Trump. So what we're seeing is quite deliberately firms, and as well asked about the training thing, are clearly deliberately, it's both the first half and the second half of staying away from discussing politics because they're worried about some tweet or some pushback. The question, you know, for Neil and for John, does that surprise you? Is that things you've seen, and you know, is that we were discussing this?
I'll respond quickly since it's not my job to respond to questions here, but nonetheless.
Come on, let's flip this.
So it's okay. So
deal with uncertainty.
Yes, exactly. So John, fair enough. So John had mentioned, you know, he had taken over Nike during COVID. So one of my COVID activities was reading shareholder proxy documents. So I read every shareholder proxy document in 2020, 2021, and on. and this is Fortune 500. And most Fortune 500 companies you haven't heard of. They're like these warehouse companies, they're making ball bearings, they're just like random companies. And all of them in 2021 are talking about DEI, ESG, being good social citizens, all of this stuff. You read all the shareholder proxy statements from last year, they disappear. And remember, the point of a shareholder proxy statement is just to say, like, here's these 5 people we want on the board of directors, trust us, like, just vote for them at the proxy meeting. And my takeaway is that a lot of companies don't lead, they're kind of following what the legitimate social trend is. And economists and sociologists have different views of what companies do. And I always used to believe that economists were right, that it's all about markets and capitalism. But the more I kind of live in this world, the sociologists believe that the world is about legitimacy. That it's about entering a world where you're seen as a legitimate entity or person. And at least reading these proxy statements, it's basically everybody doesn't want to seem like the weird person. And so in 2021, writing your proxy statement one way made you seem weird. But in 2024, 25, it's very different. So that was my takeaway.
John, is that your sense that CEOs have backed away from talking about politics?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's somewhere in a mix of the two. Certainly there's issues of the day, but also shareholders ask you. I mean, shareholders asked about, perversely, shareholders asked a lot about DEI back in that era, as did our employees. And now I think any CEO has to think about risk. Don't pick an unnecessary fight if you don't have to. And I think that's what you were talking about. There's a practical dimension that if something's core to your business, you got to talk about it. But if it's not, let's not venture an opinion that it creates a distraction.
Okay, I'm going to take control of the panel once more.
So it's employee activism.
Well, this is also more uncertainty in the panel because it's not a prepared question. But one thing that John and Chris had talked about was the core of immigration to the eBay and Intel businesses. And I'm kind of curious everyone's thoughts, just that it seems that there is a populist backlash against issues around globalization, immigration, and trade. And if you talk to people in the business community, these are things that are consensus. That like trade is like very mutually beneficial, immigration is very crucial for our innovation and R&D, yet regular people seem to be less convinced of this. And it really does seem like two ships passing in the night. And I remember actually I talked to Mitt Romney's campaign chairman, manager in 2013 after they had lost, and she was explaining, why immigration was good. And I was listening to her being like, I don't think you understand your own party. And it ended up being very prescient because she was saying, we have to become much more moderate on immigration. That's how we're going to win the 2016 election. And the exact opposite happened. So I'm kind of curious, you mentioned how important these globalization issues are. Well, how do you convince regular people that these are the proper policies?
So I'll jump on that one
first.
Yeah. I think and I don't know who else was in the panel on China right before this one, but it is easier to reframe some of these topics when you have an actual competitor that you're saying, like, if I don't do this, I'm gonna get my butt kicked. Then all of a sudden it's like, now it's not about sort of internal bickering and fighting, but I have a real competitor who is exceeding the United States in a number of areas that are really critical to the longer term, I would argue, position that the US holds. And when you can frame it in the terms of, and there was some interesting stat from the panel over there about the percentage of Chinese-born AI researchers in the frontier labs, like 20%, I think was the number they quoted. It's easier to argue for the importance of immigration when it's like, well, if we don't do this, what happens? And it's the same thing true in my current role, advising on the kind of defense and national security. They're like, why do I need all this AI and all this compute infrastructure? It's like, because they're already doing it. They're already embedding these models into the apparatus that they have as part of the whole machine. And if you don't do it, you're behind. And so we found that framing was helpful if you can kind of have a a shared sense of like, this is the real competition that's out there as opposed to some of the internal back and forth.
John, or either of you guys' thoughts?
I mean, the same question came up, honestly, a lot with Brexit. So just to be clear, Brexit was like very anti-trade, very anti-immigration, and the Brexit folks were claiming it's going to be good for the economy. And they're like completely wrong. I mean, it's been an absolute disaster economically, but the electorate didn't seem to get it. And the odd thing, there was a discussion about economists in the UK. If you polled economists, there was like 100 of them that were against it and one that was in favor of Brexit. And every time there was a debate, the BBC would call one from each side. And guess who got very good at debating? So the one, pro-Brexiteer was super slick and amazing, and the other 100 of us were terrible. And I don't know, there's kind of common soul searching 10 years later, why did we make such a bad job? Because everyone predicted if you cut down on trade and stop in immigration. I mean, another fact that's interesting, if you look at Stanford undergrads, about 10% are immigrants and non-US born. If you look at grads, at least I know economics, so I was just chairing the grad admission, 70% of our grad students are not US born. I mean, you can hear from my accent, I'm not US born, but, well, hopefully you can. And it's not Australia, by the way, I get that a lot. So I think, as with science and research, but I agree. I think there's kind of a mass failure of academics, the media, politicians, and it's not a US thing. As we were just talking, in the UK, the two most popular parties right now are Reform, which is kind of hard right, and the Greens. I was like, oh my God, if I was there, who would I vote for? I know it's not a very appealing choice, and the middle's kind of collapsed, and one is very anti-immigration, and one is, very anti-growth, and so I don't know. It's more than anti-human. It's kind of a push out to the extremes, which is a problem. And I know that John has any thoughts on this, but
Yeah, I'm going to use my time to break the rules again and ask you a question. Totally unrelated. The thing I'm going to remember tonight is your comment about Brexit, the impact of Brexit on UK growth. I hadn't realized how significant it is, and your point that 10 years later things can have cumulative effects. So maybe Neil, you have a perspective on this as well, as world-class, two of the greatest economists in the world, what are the topics you think today that we're seeing could have that kind of impact on our success 10 years from now? Or maybe from a foreign policy standpoint too.
here's something better. I mean,
See, we all try to grab control of the...
I'll let you guys answer. Go ahead.
I'm going to quickly pass on because there's a saying. There's a guy, Robert Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, who sadly passed away. But he had this famous saying: "Is once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. But if you replace the word growth with AI, you're kind of where you're at. Just AI for economics is just everything. Like, it dominates teaching, it dominates grading. I was just over lunch with my colleagues talking about, just to give you another example, grading. How do you grade? I mean, you must have the same thing. How do you grade students? Because any coursework or take-home stuff is now done by AI. And so we're falling back on two things really, which is in-class grading, like class participation. But if you have a class of 100 people, that's impossible. Or exams. But for exams, if they have a laptop, they have access to AI, so you don't have to do it for pen and paper. And we've now got this ridiculous situation that we're asking people who probably have never written in English before in pen and paper to write exams, and they're very upset, not surprisingly, if you're Spanish and you're used to spell checking. So, but AI seems to be the dominant theme, and it's just, I've been an economist for 30 years, I've never seen a theme that's just so kind of fractious as AI.
Maybe just to weigh in quickly on it, I think this goes back actually to one of the earlier questions about how do companies make long-term investments in the same way at the government. How do you make long-term policy decisions that will probably outlast whatever tenure your party has? And then how do you try to proof it enough so it's not going to get shredded by the next administration that comes in? But to me, some of the things that stand out from a technology perspective, certainly, electric grid build out, like those are things that take a really long time to do. And the types of companies that do that, if you're an investor in a utility, you're not necessarily seeking the types of returns if you're an investor in a tech company, right? So if the board or the CEO then says, hey, this is an amazing investment, we're gonna make so much money, like, I don't actually care. I want my dividend checked at the end. That's why I invest in you, not because of all this other stuff that you could be doing. And so I think from a policy perspective, you've got politicians who are trying to figure out how to balance. They can see, like, this is probably the right answer to get to, but then I have a set of constituents, just like companies do and boards do with their investors. I've got a set of constituents who maybe have a different set of priorities or a different time scale that they care about. They care about, the problem that's happening next week. and you're trying to solve a problem that's going to be out there, 10 years from now. And I don't know that there's well, clearly there's not an amazing answer. Otherwise, things would probably look a little different than they do. But being able to, and this is where companies play a unique role, being able to help build that consensus and inform policymakers effectively can go a long way. This actually goes back to an earlier discussion we were having outside as well about some of the value of not having political appointees so far down into organizations, but having people kind of stick around organizations longer to bring that memory throughout these big agencies, so that even when you do get new people funneling in, you're like, all right, there is something happening. Trust me, it's good, even if you don't totally understand it.
Excellent. So John, I want to maybe ask you about your current role. I think people might be interested, especially if we have a lot of Stanford alumni in the audience. Now, I agree with Nick that teaching during AI is challenging, but I would say managing an athletic department at university in this NIL area is more challenging. So I'm just and it's actually a very political topic, because the court system has a lot of power in how this NIL is going to go. Tommy Tuberville, who is both a U.S. Senator and a former football coach, is trying to introduce legislation to regulate NIL in college athletics. So you have to make all of these decisions with all of this legal uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty. So maybe you can just tell us how you're going through it and how you're thinking about it, given that you're leading this major department on campus.
We go from geopolitics to college football. The first thing I'll say, I'm having fun. That's the biggest question I get, are you having fun? And you get you guys do this for a living. You get to be around these students and these student athletes and these coaches and these professors at Stanford. It's just, I pinch myself because it's just a remarkable place. And these students and student athletes are just crazy how impressive they are. Neil, I'd say this, and it goes back to your question about uncertainty. When faced with uncertainty, I think the important thing is, in the face of the uncertainty, just have a point of view, have a stake in the ground for yourself that may or may not be right, and you may have different alternatives, and then work your way backwards and then stay nimble. So, for instance, in college athletics today, my simple framing, and I'm a total outsider coming in, that's a blessing and a curse, is that we're going through a period of disruption. And I've spent a good part of my career in disruptive industries. And what happens in disruption is that you have a rule set that has often been in place for a while. So think about media, right? Linear TV and then cable. Or think about commerce, right? Retail. All of a sudden, in those cases, technology, in this case, court, comes in, and it feels like all the old rules get thrown out. So you go from these very predictable set of rules to now it's like, holy cow, there's no rules. And ultimately, there's got to be another set of rules, right? Every industry, every society does ultimately want a set of rules. And I believe in college athletics, we will have a set of rules. That's my stake in the ground. And I think we can even guess what some of them are going to be. But you have to live in the lawless middle, where rules are being proposed. It's not clear if they're going to stick. It's not clear who's going to enforce them. There's all these abuses. And so I think our perspective at Stanford is there's going to be a logical set of rules. The student athlete is going to be brought back to the center. Right now, the student athlete's getting lost. They're getting exploited. It's a little bit crazy. You're going to have rules around eligibility, around transfers that are a little more in the interest of the student athlete. There'll be some rules about how you pay athletes. And then when you're in the middle of it, so we're working, and Condi, we're blessed with Condi. I guess she was doing one of these panels. Condi is leading the effort across college athletics to advocate through rules. John Levin's very involved. I'm somewhat involved. We will get there. I just don't know when or through what path. And in the middle, you've got to deal with the reality that we're in the basketball portal right now. Any of you that are following college athletics, it's just crazy. And basically, you have a bunch of schools saying, yeah, there are rules. We don't believe they'll be enforced, so we're going to do whatever we want. And you can't waste emotional energy about being outraged about that or be You say, all right, we're in this period. How are we as Stanford going to navigate our way through? Andrew and David have done a great job of navigating through football. We're trying to navigate our way through basketball right now. The Olympic sports are a little bit less impacted by those. And let's carry ourselves in a way we're proud of in hindsight and have confidence and faith and try to influence that there will be a common sense set of rules. They'll be different than these rules were, but we'll get back to them. So having that point of view versus, oh my God, it's lawless, it's going to be this way forever, is sort of what at least we're trying to do. And what's interesting, Neil, is I think people are looking to Stanford, like they want to know. It's funny, we're getting drawn in these conversations, and Connie says sometimes, that's because they're not afraid of our football team. But people are looking for someone to stand up on principle. And so we're trying to stand up on the right principles and set an example. And it may hurt us in the short term, I don't know, but I think ultimately it will serve us.
Excellent. So Nick, I want you to actually respond to something that John just said to broaden this concept beyond athletics a bit, because I was very interested that John just said it's an example of kind of disruption. And it's like sometimes disruption leads to creative accretion, but incumbents oftentimes suffer from that. So I'm kind of, you work with McKinsey and all these other things in your research. And so I'm kind of curious what we generally know about how incumbents and incumbent business leaders deal with these disruptive forces and elements that come from the outside.
Well, that is a tough question. Am I going to take that? I was actually going to riff off what John was saying.
That's fine too.
At this point, we might as well start walking around. Let's go.
We're in that lawless mode.
I was going to say, we were talking, I have quite a few, I'm struck by the athletics thing. The two comments. One is I had lunch, we were saying earlier, with Gerhard Casper about 15 years ago, just after he stepped down as being president. I remember him saying that managing Stanford is really odd and is very challenging. So you have these three different parts of it. You've got this university, you've got this massive medical complex, which revenue-wise is actually more than university. Then you've got this sports franchise, which is growing very fast. I kind of say, because I have an undergrad class where it's capped at 50, but I have about 20, 25 athletes. I'm not exactly sure because I don't precisely know all of them, but I talk to the students. The athletes have just an incredible schedule. I was talking to one of the swimmers, because this swimmer would come into my class with wet hair. And my class is 9:30 to 11:20. And I was like, tell me about your training day. And he was saying basically he trains for 2 hours, then comes to class, then has another 2 hours, and then I think it's time off. And then I think you're allowed 6 hours a day, is it?
4.
4. Well, I think he said yes, 4, but something like changing doesn't count and weights in my room. And then he said the season is 2 quarters. I said, oh, so you get 2 quarters off. And he said, well, no, because there's a third quarter. And to be honest, if you're a serious swimmer, you swim in the third quarter. And I said, you get the fourth quarter off. And he said, well, no, serious swimmers also swim in the fourth quarter. It's like, and as we know from our undergrads, they're under enormous pressure to do other stuff. So I can kind of see the athletics, the level is just so high that it's very hard for the student athletes. We were talking earlier, I mean, some of the Stanford, there was just something in the news, the first ever female soccer player that was transferred for more than $1 million, so it's kind of record-breaking globally, was a former Stanford undergrad about 5 years ago. So these are people who are kind of, elites in 2 divisions. I see this to be very hard you're kind of having people to want to be a full-time student. We know how hard it is to get into Stanford, and also expected to be basically professional level in athletics, and it's just becoming very hard. And as a professor, you see it. I'm getting all these notes because now in the ACC, people are traveling away for quite a few days and coming back. And I kind of feel sorry. I mean, the thing I feel just how challenging it is for the students. And you see the other side of it.
So I have one more question for Chris, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. We're going to have a roving mic. So just wanted to end on, part of this is how you deal with government. Mm-hmm. I know you're currently involved with government at Intel. You dealt with a lot of politicians, bureaucrats, both political, non-political employees. What would you say, if you had to say one framework for the best ways business leaders can interact with government officials? What would be your kind of clear framework on that?
Relationship matters. I know it's kind of obvious. You're oh, of course, relationships matter in DC, but it's hard to overstate how much relationships matter in DC. It's part of the reason I uprooted my family from Portland, Oregon, where we had lived. As a funny aside, Beaverton is the headquarters of Nike, and sometimes the Intel and Nike interns would play each other. let's just say maybe unlike the B2C, B2B thing, there was never confusion of who was Intel and who was Nike on playing volleyball against each other for the interns. I moved my family out to DC because there's recognition, like you just have to live and be in community with people. That's the sort of connection that actually moves the needle with people in that world. And until I lived there, I would have been like, oh, sure, I can take some trips out there, once a month and we'll figure it out. But then when your kids are going to school, when you're going to church with people, when you see them at the grocery store, when you're playing sports with them, it's just a different environment. And a lot of the trust that needs to be built gets established. DC, on average, and I'm sure it's true at other, big government centers, there's lots of people who, have their own motivations and ambitions, and will say things and not do them. And so figuring out who you can trust and who you can partner with and who will do the hard thing when it's right, even though it's disadvantageous to them, that just matters a tremendous amount. And so figuring out how to build those kinds of relationships, unlike on the business side where it's like, all right, like, if it's economically advantageous to you or financially advantageous, you'll probably do it. On the political side, the incentives can be wildly different and hard to predict. And getting people to be able to talk effectively between industry and government is not always straightforward. And that's where, when you can sit down with folks and they're like, oh, I know you. Like, we've had this shared experience. We have a relationship that's been established. There's a sense of, at least even tenuously, some sort of community that makes a huge difference. And really, it all comes down to the trust factor.
That's actually very fascinating to say. This was a little anecdote. Like, one argument some people make for why Congress doesn't really work anymore is that very few congressmen live in DC. And all this was caused in ads in the 1980s and 90s when they said, your guy was never in your district, so you should vote him out. And it used to be that people's kids played on the Little League team together, the wives were on the PTA together. This is people across parties, right? Because they all went to the same DC schools. And they say that these relationships have fractured. So these are just people you work with, they're not people in your social communities. Yeah.
These last thought, there was comments about, coming to drain the swamp. One of the government affairs people for Intel, Bruce Andrews, after kind of that was going around, he was like, we're swamp people, but we're friendly swamp people. We all live in the swamp together and we get along. And DC, it's similar to a lot of communities. It's a lot smaller than people think. Everybody remembers each other. People remember when you've done things that are dishonest, and it has a long-term impact. And they also remember when you're a trusted person and you're one of the swamp people. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to now include the audience. If people have any questions they've been dying to ask, great. We already have a couple. So we have our microphone roving around. So then please speak into the microphone. Feel free to introduce yourself too.
Sure. Hi, I'm Azita Arvani. I'm a GSB grad 1999. And I'm also on the Stanford Women on Boards, the AI Accelerator program. I have a lot of questions, but the one that sticks out is you all talked about how if you want to voice your opinion about a topic, it has to be something that's core to the business. So how do you define that core to the business? Because like some years ago, we said business is not just about shareholders, it's also about the customers, the partners, society, employees, and shareholders. So now, when you think about what's core to the business, how do you look at it? Is it just the shareholders because we forgot about ESG?
I'll give a quick thought about like kind of tactically how we did it. So in addition to running the government business and until I've been chief of staff for a number of the CEOs, so I was deeply involved in the corporate strategy and corporate communications and the exact process of determining and really was like, we made a list. We were like, these are all the issues that we think people care about or that we care about. And then you're absolutely right. I mean, it was one of the business roundtable document, the purpose of a corporation, and it's the different constituencies that are served, and people were kind of philosophically asking, what is a corporation about? Like, what is its purpose? Particularly as confidence in different public institutions were coming down, the confidence in companies, at least at the time, was still strong. So I think that the way tactically that we did it is like we can't have more than, I don't know if it was 3 or 4, and just sort of rank ordered them. And we're like, all right, exactly across the constituencies, we're like, and it's very Intel or tech-like. It's like, make a spreadsheet, assign values to these things, and see what bubbles to the top, and then look at it and say, does that feel about right? So that's the way that we had handled that.
Okay, another question?
Yes, hi. This is Nicholas from Mexico. And I was wondering, in many developing countries, we have large businesses that have a strong say on the economy and on the future of the country. And many of these countries are falling into autocracy, as it is the case in Mexico. So businesses tend to have the dilemma either to speak up and try to prevent the rule of law eroding and face a purge by the government, or not to speak up, make great deals with the government, but once the rule of law is gone, the law won't be there for you. So what would you tell businesses facing this dilemma, this conundrum? Thank you.
That's a really hard question. What do you think, Nick?
That is very good. Nick.
Well, I mean, if you want to read an interesting book on this, it's by Levitsky and Ziblatt called When Democracies Die. It was on like Biden and Obama's bookshelf. And so one interesting thing it talks about is that between the interwar period, there's like 4 countries that could have become Nazi Germany. And Finland was a classic example of this. Like Finland was very, very close to becoming like a fascist autocratic state. And one thing that stopped it is that you have business elites that stand up against the autocratic movement. And in Nazi Germany, that didn't happen. That the business elites were like, well, we should just go along because that's kind of best for our short-term shareholder value. So that's kind of one lesson we know. A lot of lessons from the interwar period. And if you're interested, that book has a lot of the compare and contrast.
I was going to make a kind of Neil type comment, which is this comes up in some of the I've taught in the business school, and that we used to teach about something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I don't know people. So basically, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I mean, you must. If you could, so roughly speaking, is there's in the US you're allowed to make facilitating payments to companies abroad to kind of speed things up. You're not allowed to pay bribes. And the rules vary across countries. In Britain, there's tighter rules, and in the US, has been slowly relaxing them. And it's a good question. So imagine you're an American company trying to win a tender, say, out in China, and you're competing against domestic companies and other companies, and they're paying bribes. What should the American company do? And on the one hand, this was the case for go through in class. Some people say they should pay bribes too, but it kind of erodes the rule of law within the country, and others said they shouldn't, they should lose the business. And I mean, this is a genuine issue, actually, not just for developing countries, and I think the current administration in the US has been weakening the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think it happened under actually Trump 1. And it's not clear where to go, but it is a live issue, actually. And right now, businesses cannot do illegal activities abroad, but they can do things that are kind of in a gray area. And the MBAs argue with each other. It's a great, whenever you teach MBAs, you want them to kind of, as I guess the former MBAs here know, butt heads. The less speaking you do and the more speaking they do, the better, basically.
We talked about speaking up in social issues before. I think in this country, CEOs are trying to figure out what political issues, because it's really hard to look the other way on some of what's happening around rule of law and other things. And your employees are looking at you saying, like, is this what we stand for? And it's lesser on the company. It's more about the society and the way you talk about the political system. And I think those, I'm so glad I'm not in that chair right now. I just worry about football. But it's in all seriousness, I think it's a hard time to be a leader about what you speak up on politically.
It's also hard we were talking about this earlier, it's also hard for Stanford. I mean, I'm a huge fan of John Levin. I've known him for many years, but when when he was made president, he was from the economics department, so when he was appointed president, there was a small internal event in economics, and we kind of celebrated, and he was being asked questions by people who, like me, or his colleagues who had known him for kind of 20 years, and someone asked him about the Israel-Palestine point. One of my colleagues, I'm not sure why they asked that question, and he just went very quiet. And you could see it's a really difficult thing to deal with. And as the leader of the university, you're expected to talk about it, but it's something that is, there are other topics, and so there are some things I was kind of waiting to see what he said, and he kind of he didn't say much. He spoke very slowly and trod a very careful path, and I think that's often the best advice.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I think 2 people have questions. So I want to do like 2 quick questions and then really quick answers. So we'll have you and one other person I know has had her hand up. So go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Belinda Nixon, and Stanford undergrad class of 1990, and a proud friendly swamp person. I live in DC.
Yeah.
I'm also taking part in the Stanford Women on Board's AI Accelerator. And with that in mind, I was wondering, what is the role of the board in helping companies manage the political turbulence?
So John, if you give me a quick response since you were on the board of Nike.
I think the board, not a lot on one way. It's to be a sounding board, because I think it's very hard for a board to be able to understand the full dynamics inside of a company. And so I think I would bring to my board, here's how we're thinking about it, push back, or let's have a debate. And they can be very helpful because they aren't in the day-to-day. But a board's job is not to shape policy on those things.
Okay, our final question.
Hi, Kristen Jacobson, 1995. I just wanted to follow up a little more on the difficulty that, like, John Lovin is in terms of how do you decide when to respond and when not to respond. And sometimes you respond because the expectations are there, and whether it's core. And sometimes Stanford chooses to respond publicly, and sometimes, and I've heard John Levin talk about why he didn't say on the NIH funding, which is truly core to Stanford, and it's like balancing the pick a fight versus when you're expected to speak up. But I know that there was a lot of discussion among alumni that weren't happy with the lack of a public response on something that was core, and I'm just like, no one would want to have to make those decisions, but I'm just curious in this context, like, how is something core and then something not core, and how do you decide, or are you weighing sort of the cost of picking a fight versus not? Anyway.
Maybe I'll just say one comment, because I've been blessed to the last 6 months to sit on John's staff, and the first thing I'll tell you, I think being a university president is the hardest job in the world right now. Second, I think we are so blessed. He is so impressive in his intellectual honesty and objectivity to think those things through. And what I've observed is he can think about what's core to Stanford's mission, and should we speak up on it? And then second, will speaking up advance the cause or not? And there are some times where actually, even if it's core to your mission, NIH being one, speaking up will make the circumstance worse, not better. And his ability to logically be very open to input, very open to different points of view, and then think his way through to a point of view that he can then explain is very impressive. I keep telling him, you're the first boss I've had in 25 years. And I'm so impressed by it. And I think we're so lucky at Stanford to have him as our president at this particular time.
Terrific. I agree with that 100% too. So I would say that I've learned a lot about uncertainty on this panel. One thing I'm certain of, though, is that we've been very lucky to be blessed with these insights from these 3 people, and hopefully you've enjoyed the discussion and had some good takeaways. Obviously, this is a very tough topic that we're not going to fully resolve in 1 hour, but I believe that we made a lot of progress in thinking through it. So please give a round of applause for it.